work. Great. All right, I'm going to do my spiel. Everyone, thank you for attending Sunny's Book Club. We read Brutes this month by Dizz Tate, which was the pick for February. Debut novel out by Catapult. I usually start these off by just reading the blurb cover to give us some grounding work to go off of, and then we can get into it with a couple of questions and start the discussion and go from there. Okay. The Virgin Suicides meets the Florida Project in this wildly original debut, a coming-of-age story about the crucible of girlhood from a writer of rare and startling talent. We would not be born out of sweetness, we were born out of rage, we felt it in our bones. In Falls Landing, Florida, a place built of theme parks, swampy lakes, and scorched bougainvillea flowers, something sinister lurks in the deep. A gang of 13-year-old girls obsessively orbits around the local TV preacher's daughter, Sammy. She is mesmerizing, older, and in love, but suddenly Sammy goes missing. Where is she? Watching from a distance, they edge ever closer to discovering a dark secret about their fame-hungry town and the cruel cost of a ticket out. What they see will continue to haunt them for the rest of their lives. With a voice that is darkly beautiful and brutally compelling, Dizz Tate captures the violence, horrors, and manic joys of girlhood. Brutes is a novel about the seemingly unbreakable bonds in the we of young friendship and the moment they are broken forever. Oh, someone was just in the waiting room, but then they went away. Okay. Cool. So also this month, I'm co-hosting with Jalen from the Bar in the Bookcase, a fellow BookTube bestie. And I think we're going to keep this conversational and light, but let's start off with the riveting question. Jalen, how did you find this book? And then we'd love to open it up to everyone and we can kind of popcorn.
I'm a little conflicted about this book. I really like the style of it. I think she is doing some interesting things with the collective we, with just her descriptions and using that voice to kind of center this narrative, and then also breaking apart in the adult sections with the individual perspectives. Love all of that. But I think in the last quarter, with the more fever dreamy, kind of weird aspects of this, I was looking through Goodreads and then also a bunch of critical reviews of this book, and the consensus seems to be that everyone's just confused, which is really interesting. So I'm glad that I wasn't alone in that, because I was like, did I not read this closely enough? Like, was it too late at night when I was reading it? Like, was it me? I don't know. So I'm excited to talk about it, though, because I think it's a really fun book club discussion book to really see what everyone makes of it. So yeah, conflicted overall.
Cool. Any other first impressions people want to share?
I'll share. Me, the one who's halfway through the book. So I really was into the collective we. Definitely gave me Virgin Suicides vibes, and just like that feeling of like longing and admiration for somebody that is sort of a stranger, but you want to keep it that mysterious way. I've only read one of the adult sections, so I'm really curious to read the rest, but at first it threw me off to go from that we and like having the word we in front of like a thought or a feeling, and just like implying that everybody felt the same way and thought the same way, to going to the first person narrative it threw me off at first. And then I realized that I really liked Hazel's perspective that the author wrote from. So I'm curious to see if the author does like gets different enough between all of the other adult characters throughout the rest of the book.
Yeah. How is everyone finding the choral voice, the we? I don't know if I have a lot of other novels that I can point to outside of the Virgin Suicides that implies that kind of technique and kind of uses it as a narrative choice. But I found it, again, like very evocative and distinctive, especially as kind of capturing adolescence and I guess unifying that sometimes really singular and like painful experiences that you think are unique to you. But I think like that's what was so interesting about the we in this form, is the universalization of just insane prepubescent pain and just like kind of normalizing that and showing it from that we standpoint. But yeah, I loved the adult kind of flash forwards and those interspersings of it, it kept me interested and kind of wanting to dig and like see how they correlate from the teenage girls into where they ended up. I also think it's funny, a lot of the reviews of this book are like girls, women, girls, but there's also a queer boy in this book who's very central to the narrative too. So I don't want to forget our lad Christian. But yeah, I liked it, and it felt fresh, I guess I would say, from what I've been reading recently.
Yeah, I would say if it was all written in that collective we, I probably wouldn't have liked it as much. And even like until we got to Hazel's first chapter, I was like, I don't really know if I'm liking this. But then I do agree that I feel like those we chapters were almost there was sort of like a sense of like genericness to them, in that, like you said, it has to sort of apply to that pain of adolescence that everyone goes through. But I felt like I didn't really know who these characters were until I got to their adult chapter. And then I really got to know and I was pretty impressed that just in those short chapters, I was really able to get a nice sort of glimpse into who they are as a character. So yeah, I really liked that. But I think the adult chapters were my favorite for sure.
I really loved the collective we, especially at the end. I'm sorry, Lizzie, for the spoilers, but when Jody would kind of switch and kind of falter between the singular and the plural, oh my, that was just so heartbreaking. Like those moments where she felt like completely and totally alone, and then trying to get back to we, and it just wasn't happening, and it just like, oh, slayed me. So I thought it was beautiful. Captivating. I loved it.
I actually read the book twice. The first time around, I read it straight through as a narrative, and the first 2/3 of it felt a little slow, and I really loved the last third of it, interestingly enough. And then when I reread it, I read it out of order, so just the adult chapters, and then the chapters when they were kids. And I stumbled across something really interesting, which is she did an interview with this podcast called Book Squad Goals, and the narrator, the host of it, her name is Kelly, and she's actually an old friend of Tate's and was the model for Layla's character, or for a couple of moments of Layla's character. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And one thing she said in that interview was that she wrote this draft in so many multiple drafts, and the collective we came to her very late in the process. And it was only when she had stumbled across this quote by George Saunders, where he talks about, in order to represent an emotional truth, sometimes you have to violate reality. And that she realized that the collective we was the vehicle to do that. It reminded me a lot of Atwood's Penelope, where she has the hanged maidens doing the narration in the text. And there's something very destabilizing, I think, with that collective we voice.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I love okay, maybe that's a good transition into the fever dream, the idiosyncrasies of this book, and the lack of stability that I think all of us found maybe as a reader throughout the entirety of the narrative, and what that means, and how that affects your reading experience. I am of two minds about it. In the worst of times, it made me feel like I wasn't in safe hands with Dizz Tate as a writer, you know, like I couldn't trust her authorial voice and like understand what she was doing. And then at the other times, I think it's really generous and like collaborative as a reader and writer to kind of like dig through the narrative and kind of connect the dots yourself and find out what was happening. And I also think it's like very well fitting for the larger thematic things that are going on in this book, like fame, obsession, girlhood, and Florida, honestly. But did anyone else, how was your response to the fever dream-ness of this novel and your reading experience? Jalen.
Yeah, I was waiting for someone to jump in. Okay, I'm going to start with, so one thing I'll start with is, Sujay mentioned George Saunders in that quote, and I think it's really interesting because this book made me think about Bunny by Mona Awad a little bit, one of my favorite books. And there's a chapter in there where it uses the collective we once the main character becomes a part of like the cult of girls. And Mona Awad, she also teaches at Syracuse alongside George Saunders. So it's just an interesting tie that I noticed when you said that, Sujay. But aside from that, I mean, I tend to find like certain, I don't know. I think here the problem that I had with the fever dreamy aspect of it was like even from a sentence to sentence, like following the narrative, like I was confused on like that level of like trying to figure out what the image was showing, like what she was trying to show me with like the setting, how the characters were moving together. But on the other hand, like one thing I really liked was how using the we and then also like the binoculars and how they're all kind of looking out of their windows and like using that as like a framing of looking into the mystery. Like certain aspects of that worked for me, but I think as a narrative, that's when it kind of faltered for me because I couldn't like follow what was happening. And then I just kind of got frustrated as a reader, but I was trying to, see past that and be like, okay, well, what am I bringing to this? And what is she's clearly doing it on purpose. So like, what am I don't know. How much is that like a me problem, I guess? I don't know if anyone relates to that, but.
Yeah, actually, there's a great interview she did where she talks about her inspiration being Joy Williams, who also is another writer, writes a lot about Florida. And in the interview, she says that when she was reading Williams' work, she said it very accurately captures this disorienting feeling when it hits you that the world is an unstable place and one that you do not understand and which does not understand you. Williams captures Florida as I remember it: mysterious, edgy, deranged, slow, isolated, shallow, ancient. And I would use all of those adjectives to describe her rendering of Florida in this book too, right? And so I think it's a purposeful literary device of defamiliarization, making these everyday things feel very out there and unfamiliar and really terrifying. And she says, she doesn't like horror as a genre, but she wrote a book with a lot of horror elements in it, right? Because of that defamiliarization.
Yeah, I love that. Every time Sujay talks, I'm just gonna say, love that. Great. I guess that brings me to my struggle with like metaphor in this book and trying to track the chronological events of the trauma that was actually happening. I think that's like the disconnect in my brain is trying to understand what each metaphor was standing for, whether it came from Sammy's like giving birth to the pebble with teeth in it, to what the swamp monster represented, to why Sammy was running away, why they were hiding her in the first place, and each character's individual contributions to this main event, which me and Jalen were texting before this, and I was like, oh, they were looped into a child pornography ring. Like that is the crux of this book, is this star search quest that kind of all of the girls are yearning for and are obsessed with is actually so deeply entrenched in the community that it's like led by one of their moms and their partner. And that is the trauma of this town, is the brutalization of their lack of innocence, their loss of innocence, and kind of getting ringed into this hypersexualized, act of violence against them, against their will. And I don't know if I have a question about that. It's more so, I think that was my struggle as a reader, again, is just trying to find out what was metaphorical and then what was actually happening, which I think was interesting for her, and also kind of a smart choice of not having this be like a true crime book where the suspect is really like put on trial. I thought it was much more interesting to see kind of the aftershocks of adulthood, of how this trauma followed them and what it played out to be.
Yeah, just to chime in. So in February, I read Brutes, and I also read two books. One is On the Savage Side by Tiffany McDaniel. And then I also read I Have Some Questions for You by Rebecca Mackay. And CJ, what you were just mentioning about the kind of true crime subverting the expectations of true crime. I think all three books are doing that in an interesting way. And I feel like that's kind of a recent thing that I've been seeing with fiction in particular, that's exploring how we tell true crime stories. And I think the horror lens here was really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't really have anything else smart to say on that front, but like, I just thought that was an interesting through line, is how this book is exploring how you can tell the impacts of, I don't know, like memory on adulthood. I feel like that's an interesting question too, how it's playing on the adult sections here. Yeah, I don't know. It's fun to read in a novel form for sure.
I was actually going to say that I was pretty impressed how we kept switching perspectives between like when they were kids and then when they were adults. And I was impressed that I was able to sort of like follow the story chronologically, even though it was told seemingly so out of order. But I agree, like with the last few chapters and like all the metaphors of like Jody giving birth to the pebble. I guess I wasn't sure, not Jody, Sammy, but I wasn't really sure if she was actually pregnant or, you know, if she maybe got like sucked into the ring too and she was like pregnant with the predator's baby and that's why she was like feeling really unsafe. And then yeah, the monster, I still don't really know what that all.
Yeah, I'm glad. Hi, I'm Amanda. This is the first time I've joined this, by the way. But this book club was actually my way of getting like back into fiction, and this was quite a book to start with. But I really enjoyed it. But I'm really glad to hear other people's reflections because I closed it and I was like, I'm not really sure what happened, to be honest. Like I don't know what I just read. So that was really like my first impression. But similar to what you're all saying, I think there's just like pieces missing. Like I would love to go back and read it again, and almost like there was something said when I think it's like Layla's with her daughter or someone goes back to visit Layla and they both like see something through like the windshield of the car, and I was like, oh, what was that about? Like there's like so many pieces missing for me, but I didn't mind it. Like it was still really enjoyable to read. So yeah, I'm glad that I came, because I kind of came to the book club to find out what this book was about. So it's it's great.
You're not alone. Literally texting Jalen 20 minutes before it started. And I'm like, wait, so is this what happened? Is this who? Okay. Even like, do you guys have memory of Mia's mom's husband, Stone, in this book? Okay, Sujay does because he read the book twice. Lizzie, you're halfway through, so it sounds like you do. But me and Jalen were like, who's Stone? Have no memory of this fool. But he's obviously like the ringleader of, you know, traumatizing these girls and making content out of whatever. And I also like that the book didn't give us like very descriptive, you know, portrayals of whatever that is. I also think that was a really smart authorial move now that I'm thinking about it. But to backtrack, is this what we think happened? Is this what we think the order of events was? Sammy and Mia got close. Mia's mom saw Sammy and her status as a preacher's daughter and like the gross things that can happen with that context online with her being sexualized, and they exploited her and made content out of it. And then she freaked out, shaved her head, wanted to run away, had no tools or resources to be able to deal with that. And then the girls hid her. And then she
That
ran
was my
away.
take.
Okay.
I think so. Yes.
Great. I'm glad I'm tracking because that all is clicking for me like literally today. Are there any adult flash forwards that really stuck out for you guys in your mind? I think I want to talk more about like Christian's and his confronting of Mia. If that sounds okay. Cool.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that because for me, and again, maybe I'm missing something other than like getting to know the characters individually. I'm not sure what the adult portions like really added to the story for me. Like they didn't like put pieces together for me. So yeah, I'm very curious about that.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was more just like how trauma manifests itself, whether you were directly or indirectly exposed to it, and just kind of seeing how each character kind of had different varying like emotional responses or inability to kind of move through the world in any stabilized way is kind of what they were there to show me to show me.
But I also think the adult sections were cool because a lot of times they would give you like a little nugget of what was to come.
Mm-hmm.
That really kept me enticed. And I was like, and then even, you know, like when we were getting to the point of like the child predator ring, it was like you knew what was going to happen and you were kind of like, it was almost like suspenseful, I guess.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And there's certain themes that actually run through all of the adult sections. So for instance, doors always come up in every section where there's an adult voice, either getting stuck indoors, unable to cross through doors. And this is a super strange take, but I think this is actually a climate change novel that is using this very important veneer of trauma fragmentation to cover up this actually notion of climate change. If you go back and read the adult sections, there's always mentioning a mention to the environment collapsing, right? And fish dying in tanks. And there's a lot there to unpack, but I think that's a big part of this text as well.
Yeah, I noticed that too. I'm glad you brought that up because I was wondering what the doors symbolized. It seemed pretty like, I mean, I'm not really good with like metaphors and stuff. So if I was able to notice it, I feel like it's pretty, there must be something going on.
Yeah, like the threshold of innocence or that kind of cusp of adolescence to teenage adulthood is probably my very English 101 understanding of what a door means. Wow. I have to go back and read for the environmental lens now. And I also think like something that is so present in Florida is, I don't know if anyone here has connections to Florida, but I was born and raised there. My whole family lives there. And you can't be there without noticing that it's built on a swamp. Like it should not exist, the entirety of the state. And that kind of sinking, collapsing feeling and just like presence and surrounding of like nature overtaking the built structures is so intrinsic to what it feels like to be in Florida and just the uncanniness of it. So I really love that you tied that to kind of all of the adults like seeing that landscape kind of through that more environmental lens. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and even going to like the last scene when they're looking at the lake, I believe, and they're asking like, is it sleeping? And I think it's Jody, is that right? Who says like it's not sleeping, or she like sees through that, and then the lake goes up in flames. And the last line is, sometimes the world deserves a burning, which is really interesting because I was talking to CJ before about like how the lake to me sort of symbolized this corruption of the entire community and how it kind of goes up in flames and how like they think that it's, you know, it's over, like you can kind of, I don't know, it's just there and it's not alive, but it really always is. And in tying that to climate change, it's a really interesting perspective on that I hadn't thought about before.
Mm-hmm. How did the Floridaness feel to you guys as readers of this book? Did it feel like an accurate rendering? Was it kind of like overtly described? I kind of oscillated in between those two feelings. Sometimes I was like, oh my God, I can't have another paragraph describing the mugginess of the air. But at the same time, some parts of it were so spot on for me. So I just wondered how that felt to you guys.
I liked it. I think I've been to Florida once or twice briefly, so I don't have like a strong familiarization with it, but I tend to love fiction that's centered in Florida. Like Laura Vandenberg, a lot of her stuff is centered in Florida, and she kind of leans into this sort of like surrealist environmental aspect in her work that I think is really interesting. So yeah, I don't have a personal connection, but I liked the setting for this book for sure.
I liked the comparison to the Florida Project, which was in the like blurb on the cover, because I feel like it gives this vibe of being so close yet so far for these characters. Like they're just out of reach of like what they think is unattainable to them. And I think it says it in Hazel's chapter, which is again the only adult chapter I've read, that they wanted to go anywhere, just not here. And I think that it gave it in the Florida Project too, gives just that feeling of like you're so close, like you can hear the screams of the people on the roller coasters, but you're living this miserable life.
Yeah, that's something I noticed early on too, that divide between the walled community with this like big white wall and the perfectly manicured grass, and then the apartments in which the girls live, and how kind of precarious and liminal that space is, just like a door, right? They're this kind of in between the theme parks and the really wealthy people, right? They're kind of straddling that interstitial space. And I haven't been to Florida, but when I think about it, I think a lot about artifice, as well as, like you said, CJ, right, building upon a place that shouldn't have a community on it, and just kind of trying to outdo nature and kind of control and harness nature. And that feels very much a part of this text too.
Yeah, and even human nature, right? Like this kind of trying to categorize people and people resisting categorization in this book, I found pretty affecting. Even in that flash forward chapter with Christian confronting Mia, like I love how she doesn't bend to guilt in that. Like she was like, I was traumatized too, you know what I mean? Like I can't help you here in this like campaign you're on for any kind of justice or truth finding here. I thought that was really interesting. But to go back to like escapism and like wanting to get outside of the present moment you're living in and also the material surroundings, I thought this is the best summation of that. We squashed our faces against the glass of our own lives. Is this it? We asked. And I love that. I think that's such a good descriptor of this really weird adolescent period, and also what it feels like to just want to escape your surroundings by any means possible. The other adult passage that I loved, some of them were like just okay to me. Hold on, let me try to find her. Isabel on page 207, where they go to the Christianity themed theme park. So Florida core, just like absolute insanity that would only exist there or like in the depths of the Midwest Bible Belt somehow. I thought it was so evocative and could have just been like a singular short story for sure, and wouldn't surprise me if she had published it that way before. I don't know if I have anything to say, but I loved it. That was that was my favorite adult chapter for sure.
So I'm curious if the other adult chapters had more of a mature feeling, because the one that I read still felt very immature to me. And I don't know how it would be read by somebody older, like older than all of us who are in this book club right now. Because it still seemed like the adults were having very adolescent views and thoughts and like sort of self absorption, and it could be due to their trauma. I mean, it could be anybody's could feel that way due to trauma, but I'm just curious what everyone thought about the other adult chapters.
I kind of noticed something similar about the way that the mothers were described. They were kind of like grouped in the same way that the teenage girls were. So I kind of wonder if that's almost like the thought is not fully fleshed out yet. I'm not really sure, but like a view on adulthood too, that it's like some people don't get past that.
And it could be just that the author is very young.
That too.
Yeah, I mean, the chapter with Jody is really all about the lake monster again. And that was a really confusing one for me, where I was like, is there a lake monster? Like, no, there isn't. But like, what is, and I think that's probably an example of like the trauma, right? Like what she's going through, like as a mother herself, like still fixated on this idea of like something in the lake, was really interesting.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, I noticed how like in the end, just in the last 2 pages, how Jody refers to them as like the mothers, and using like the they instead of the we. So kind of that separation, that's really interesting to see how she describes the different units in the community in like collective ways. Is really strange and cool that I didn't pick up on initially.
Yeah, Sujay, I'm curious, since you read the adult chapters twice, if you felt any of that immaturity shine through.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think it's really linked to that discussion we were having about trauma and girlhood. And so in that interview that I was mentioning earlier, she talks about how she wanted the novel to end with this great kind of exuberance around youth and this ability to kind of live in this moment of frantic panic, but also joy. And I thought that was a really interesting thing to say, because reading that chapter, I'm not sure where the joy is, right, in that last chapter. But in terms of maturity, they seem to all be frozen and in kind of time, or definitely in that kind of traumatic moment. And I think Christian especially, because he very pointedly is confronting me, and she says, you left her there, or something like, and so I think that they're all kind of arrested in this moment. So even though they're having children and growing up and going through these stages of life, they're not essentially developing further.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking back at Hazel's section, which I believe is the first adult section, and she's having a conversation with her mom, and her mom is questioning Hazel on why she's like idolizing her childhood. And there's a quote where she says, the mom to Hazel says, "You idolize something that did not exist. You were miserable children and made my life hell. Why are you acting like your childhood was some glorious place to run back to?" Which is interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, which is like
there, but
an incredibly immature thing for a parent to say to their child, which I think just like nets on our thesis of all of them having experienced trauma in some way, the mothers included. Also, like the trauma of a child going missing who was your kid's friend, like that's an obvious note that just occurred to me too. Like that's obviously traumatizing as a parent, most likely. Yeah, the mothers as a chorus of like kind of squawking, like broody chickens who are just kind of in the background gossiping and kind of judging the pastors' wives, and that kind of further divide, not only from a socioeconomic standpoint, but kind of a cultural standpoint of like who they surround themselves with, and that divide of class really is interesting to me and feels very Florida too, where everything is just kind of like dovetailed against each other because of lack of proximity, and all of those things are competing in real time. Jalen, your favorite topic, one of your favorite topics, is the trauma plot in literary fiction, contemporary fiction being published today. Is this a trauma plot book?
Ooh, great question. I'm divided, because I think Lizzie was picking up on some of this in terms of, in the adult sections, those to me somewhat read as falling into that trauma plot trope, I guess, of the kind of, I don't know, flattening the characters into their trauma in a sense. But I think the collective we, contrasting with those sections, really help sort of get around some of the criticisms of trauma plots generally, and kind of really, so I guess I think it sort of escapes it in a way, because the contrast there I think is so crucial to how this book is operating, that I think seeing them in a collective versus the adulthood, and then also kind of the mystery and horror elements, make it something more than just kind of that flattening effect. But I do think, like, I wonder, or I was thinking about how the adult sections could have been maybe more effective as a contrast than they might have been presented here. So I don't know if anyone has thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it escapes it, but pretty narrowly, by a tiny margin of that flattening effect that goes into kind of rendering what the trauma experience is for these characters.
I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
Or I was just going to say, do you think that flattening was maybe intentional though? Because in some ways, as adults, the girls who are now women are still very similar. Like another thing I noticed is that a lot of them, like the concept of like waitresses kept coming up. Like a lot of them were servers or bartenders. So again, I kind of wonder if it was intentional. And again, the author was trying to say like, maybe this is an experience that is shared among a lot of women, and like kind of there's still kind of these like any women, but we're getting a little bit more of their like individual traits. I don't know, but
I think. Oh, sorry.
No, I was done.
Okay, no, I completely agree, and I think the proof of that is in, what is this, chapter 15, that single page chapter.
Yeah.
That absolutely slayed me, that I'm not sure whose perspective it was in, because typically the numbered chapters were with the group, but this one was just after, I think, Jody was assaulted. And it was like one of the most like painful and relatable things, and I feel like it applies to a lot of different trauma. So I think that collective woman perspective, I totally agree with it.
Yeah, Tate actually worked as a waitress for many, many years and talks about bringing that experience into it. In that way, reminded me a lot of Lucia Berlin and the Manual of Cleaning Women, right? This kind of unseen sector of society that is completely invisible, right? And you see them, right? They'll say, I looked at him right in the face, trying to make myself known, right? And that's certainly echoed in these particular professions, right?
Yeah, and I like there's a line, I can't remember exactly where it was, but it said something about how a waitress can like learn more about humanity than like any therapist could. And I think anyone who's worked as a waiter or waitress knows how hellacious it can be. So I enjoyed that.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I kind of want to go back on what I said now about the trauma plot aspects, because I do think that this book is sort of like, what is the word? In contrast to character, I would say, like, you know, explicitly using the collective voice, despite it trying to then look at them individually later. I still think that she is grappling with how do you look at trauma in a collective perspective. And so maybe her goal wasn't really necessarily to make each character to be this fully rounded idea, even when she's looking at them directly, like, to still show how the collective aspects of their trauma play out in their lives. But it wasn't, so maybe like the question of trauma plot on this book isn't one that fits Pearl Sagal's, you know, argument really. I think it's kind of doing its own thing, so maybe it even further pushes it away from criticism on that front. I don't know, but that's just an idea I had.
I do think in general, though, it's more interesting to read about like how a singular trauma can affect characters in different ways. So I guess it is like a little less interesting that they all seem to be kind of have a similar outcome in their adulthood. But yeah, I guess I don't really know what else I want to say about that, but that's just, yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at chapter 15 on page 261, which is that single page chapter. And I think another theme running through this book is morality, with Sammy being a preacher's daughter and that kind of expectation, I guess, culturally that is put upon preachers' kids. And then also the obvious like connotations of assault and what that means for young girlhood. Yeah, I think this chapter is interesting, comparing assault to like, how do I want to say this? Like, like a wound or like dirt. There's something like I don't like about that, because it's out of your control, and I don't like the marker of something I guess wounding you against your will, but I also think it's true in some sense. Does anyone know what I'm talking about and can verbalize that a little bit more? Do you have the same reception to that chapter?
Yeah, and I also think the wording was really interesting because the way it's worded makes it seem like I assumed this was Jody speaking, but after Emily's comment, I think it kind of was meant to be sort of like not like clear who exactly it was. But she's very much like blaming herself, like she was supposed to protect this bowl and she didn't. And I think that that's like probably resonates with a lot of people with trauma. Like they feel like it's their fault, that they let themselves be dirtied in some way.
Mm.
Yeah,
Oof.
and I'm just rereading it now. I'm trying to like quickly skim it, but I think it's interesting also how this chapter is framed in the second person perspective. So like the first time really implicating the reader, which I think is kind of cool from a form perspective, but then also how near the end it says how you are upset that you're not the one who dirtied the bowl with the dirt, and so then you break it and pretend it doesn't exist. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at trauma and how, despite you trying to control that, like there's still the emptiness that comes from trying to control it, even when you have some autonomy. Like, it's still stripped from you because you're still left, empty on that front. It's a
Yeah,
really beautiful passage.
Yeah, I guess it's like master compartmentalization and also kind of harkens back to the fantastical in this book for some reason in my brain. Like you can't focus on the reality of what happens, so you're gonna put your energy and mind to the conjuring of something that couldn't exist in the first place. I think that's a really nice metaphor for all of the trauma implied in this book.
I took that to be actually Sammy's voice because it opens with that line, I do not want to clutter the room with any more words. And so I think that room is, the occupants are the other people, right? And it's Sammy we don't hear from until this moment. And the references to the soul, to the holiness, reminds me of somebody who would have been a preacher's child, right? Growing up with this kind of vernacular in the everyday, right? The sacred, the profane around them. So I took this as kind of her interjecting her tiny moment of narrative, right? Into what this attack maybe felt like for her.
And that mention of the room makes me think of the arsonist stepbrother. I kind of forget how he's related to our group of characters, but that end scene where her room is on fire and they find the piece of paper that says "gone swimming," which is, quite literally words in her room that kind of make the search materialize into this found monster at the end. Yeah, I love that correlation, CJ. I think like before we wrap up, unless there's anything else that everyone is like wanting to focus on that we didn't, is I feel like we didn't talk at all about Eddie or arsonist boy, whoever, I even forget his name. Luke? Question mark? Does anyone know?
Eddie was like an interesting one to me. And I just sort of like was putting this together as you were talking, was the like competition at the mall, and Eddie is the one that actually gets out of like he wins and he does get out, whereas like this idea of like a ticket out through like being picked by Star Search like isn't actually true. It just like gets you deeper in to like this community, but Eddie actually does get out. So that was like, I don't know, that was like really an interesting piece to me, and like whatever ends up happening to him.
Hi, everybody. My name is Blair. I'm from North Carolina. I'm so sorry I joined like 15 minutes ago. I joined because I wanted to hear what y'all's thoughts were on the pebble that was found in the hammock, like when she was, I guess like, after she was trying to get away. Do y'all know what I'm talking about? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, we do know the pebble.
Yeah. So what exactly was the pebble? Like, I wanted to understand, was it like a literal pebble, or like what was that situation? Because I like totally did not understand when I was reading. I was just like shocked that there was a pebble between her legs.
I genuinely thought that she like passed the kidney stone because these kids are so like not cared for
Right.
and malnourished, but like I honestly don't know.
Right. I was like, what is this? And I Googled it. I was like trying to figure it out. I was like, what is this situation? Like, I mean, she was so upset over it, and there was like blood. And I mean, I just like didn't understand. It was obviously very traumatic for her and for all of them.
Is it possible that was like a metaphor for a miscarriage?
That's how I took it. Yeah. Exactly. And a pebble, this is a very literal reading, so don't take it seriously, but a pebble is a small stone, and stone is who attacked her. So I know.
Right.
Wait, that's genius though. Okay.
That is very smart. Yeah.
Damn.
I like that.
You just blew my
And then
mind.
with the aquarium situation, when she was like, one of the girls was standing there with her daughter, what was she referencing about her childhood that she like didn't want her to know about, but she did know about?
That to me was,
So I remember that portion.
yeah, that to me was like a interpretation of, hold on, let me go back to it. That's on page like 216-ish.
It's like they were standing in front of like the aquarium, and she was talking about how she was like gonna push her into. It was very weird, and then like abruptly ended, and I was like, "What was that?" Like, I did not understand.
Yeah, I think that was the mom, Isabel, confronting the fact that her kid also can't be protected from whatever kind of sexual trauma happened to Isabel in this book as well. And almost like the urge, instead of wanting to protect her even more, is make her face it and push her towards whatever reality of truth is happening about the trauma the kid is experiencing too. That was my read of it.
Interesting. Okay, well, thank you, because I was like, I wanted to get on the call just for that. I was like, thank you so much for telling me your thoughts.
Yeah.
I also in that scene got a little bit of like jealousy from Isabel that like she lost her innocence so young, and so then like I don't know, she has this daughter who is very young and like deserves that protection, but like why does she get it but I don't? It's kind of the vibe that I got too.
Yeah, and that last sentence is so haunting. She's saying to the daughter, "It is not just a dream," I whisper, and I hold her steady as she starts to scream. That sense of control over it's like such a creepy image. I think this book is full of those, but that one's like particularly haunting.
I can see it too. Clear as a memory, the outline, dark and sticky, creeping closer, a story I wish she did not have to know. Yeah. Happy note to end on. Yeah, cool. Does anyone else have any final thoughts, topics we didn't cover? No, we're feeling good. All right. Well, thanks for joining, you guys. Really appreciate being in conversation with you all. It helped me unpack what was happening in this book a lot and made me appreciate this novel more. If I didn't have this conversation with you guys. So thanks for being here as always. And hope you have a
Thank
cool
you.
day. Yeah. I'm going to stop recording. Hold, please.